About 15 years ago, when I was a road officer, we were probably each officer was probably doing about 150 reports a year. Now it's probably in excess of 350 reports per officer per year. Everything, it's hard to find a crime in which there's not a connection to drugs, to the opioid crisis, and to the meth crisis, and things like that. So it's definitely, I would say it's tripled around here as far as the crime rate in relation to things involving drugs. We've had to adopt policies as far as field testing narcotics when we come across them out on the streets. Where we used to just field test right away, now we have to be a lot more careful. We have to be careful of the dangers of fentanyl and carfentanil mixed in with the heroin and things like that. We've had one situation where one officer was exposed to fentanyl and had to go to the hospital because he was overcome by the symptoms associated with fentanyl. And so we have to be a lot more careful. We have to do things a lot differently. Where used to we just put on a pair of gloves and field test something. Nowadays we have to be a lot more careful, and oftentimes we send it to the laboratory to have narcotics, street drugs field tested before we even touch them. It appears that the everyday opioid or heroin user, their bodies build up a tolerance to what those drugs have to offer. So therefore, the drug dealers and the manufacturers of these street drugs, they add fentanyl and sometimes carfentanil, which is even a stronger painkiller, basically. Carfentanil has been added, and it was actually invented and derived for the sole purpose of being a large animal tranquilizer, like for rhinoceroses and elephants and so forth. So you can imagine how much of a pain tolerance and how much of a tolerance to these narcotics people have built up if they're using things that contain carfentanil. And when we refer to a bad batch of heroin, well, obviously all heroin is bad. But whenever fentanyl is added to the mix, there's not an accurate way of these people just out here on the streets to effectively divide the right amounts of that fentanyl to where it's not a lethal dose. So you might be getting a little bit of fentanyl here, and then in another dose of heroin be getting a large dose of it. So there's not any kind of an accurate science to it. They're just taking heroin and mixing carfentanil with it right on kitchen tables and things like that. So it's a very unsafe situation, and you never know what dose or what amount of fentanyl that you're getting with the heroin with the average drug user. One of the things from a law enforcement perspective, of course, we look at it from the supply side. We try to cut down the supply, no doubt. So our part isn't so much the treatment side of it as much as it is the controlling the supply and trying to cut down the supply. And it would be nice if we could completely eradicate it, but we do our best to cut down on the supply. The big thing that I see is if there was a foreign army on the Mexican border coming this way to invade the United States and to take lives and to kill our young people, we would be doing whatever it took to stop that. But as it is, and not getting into an immigration issue or any of that, but just from a drug standpoint, our southern borders, most places, there's really, the border is just an imaginary line. There's no kind of protection. There's nothing to stop these drugs from flowing in. There's a distribution network of these drugs that is greater than Walmart's or any other large chain of stores have. There has to be to supply all of these communities within the United States with drugs. And that all starts mostly in the upper 90 percentile comes from the southern border. And it just dumbfounds me how we don't do what it takes, and not enough people are getting behind that cause of trying to secure our southern border. There's not any one that stands out because there's been so many different young people that have succumbed to this problem. There's no one that's really any more of a priority than the other. It's sad when any young person or any person of any age loses their life. Life is so short as it is, and whenever you see a young life that normally wouldn't be lost, that would be a thriving member of society, would grow up, would have children, would have a career, and do the things that the rest of society does. However, they get involved with these drugs, and that doesn't happen. Their lives are cut short. This is not a drug that knows either side of the tracks, whereas some other drugs in the past have. This affects kids and young people, especially from all walks of life and all different economic backgrounds. That is the thing. The heroin is not, and the opioids is not as defined as, say, the methamphetamine symptoms are. They're not as, especially to someone who's just started using opioids. Some of the big signs obviously are sluggishness, sleepiness, lack of appetite, things like that, but definitely not as predominant as what the methamphetamine symptoms are. Oftentimes, whenever we get contacted by a loved one or somebody close to a person with an opioid problem, oftentimes they feel like they're doing them a disservice by coming to law enforcement. They feel like they're a snitch, so to speak. But the best thing that they could possibly do to save that person's life is to get them still, and just so that they can get into treatment. And oftentimes that means coming to jail. That's not necessarily a fun reality or a fun thing to think about, but it's certainly, I've seen it save lives, where people will come to us and they'll tell us about their loved one having a drug problem. We'll go there, we'll find things, we'll make an arrest, we'll bring them to jail, we'll get them still. Just because they come to jail doesn't mean they're going to prison. Oftentimes, especially if they're not a repeat offender, oftentimes they're looking at treatment. They're looking at things that aren't even going to be part of their permanent record. But I strongly urge people to, if you have somebody in your family or a friend who is really out there on drugs or opioids, especially heroin, to do what it takes to get them still. And if that means coming to jail, then that's sometimes the only alternative, and that's the only way you're going to save their life. I really don't have a good answer there for you. I mean, there's not. We're so understaffed and everything that there's a lot I'd like to do, and no doubt we try to work with the people that are on the treatment side of things and whatever, and it's particularly for people who just need help. We try to encourage that with regard to stay in contact with the prosecutors and try to advocate for something other than jail time. And there's a lot of times where I will lobby the prosecutor's office to go some other route besides jail time or imprisonment or something like that, because oftentimes that's just not what these folks need, and it's not gonna fix the problem. They'll just be right back until they get that drug problem fixed.